I am Rosalind Regina Nichols. I am the pastor of Freedom's Chapel Christian Church. I am also the great-great-granddaughter of Preston Roberts, to whom I'm going to speak about on this evening. So this was in a newspaper in 1904, I believe, and the title of the article is "Cross for a Negro: Confederates to Honor a Veteran Who Was a Slave." Visitors to the Tennessee camp at the Confederate reunions in the past few years will remember at the Memphis, Tennessee Uniformed Company's headquarters an old Negro in gray uniform who stood faithful and jealous guard over everything pertaining to the company. He wore the uniform, cap, and badge of Company A, Confederate veterans. Visitors who go to the next reunion, which is to be held in Nashville in the summer, will see him again as affable, as efficient, as respectful, as young as ever, gray uniform, cap, badge, and all. But this time he will wear, in addition to these, the Confederate Cross of Honor, which the women of the South have had made for all Confederates who saw actual service in the stirring days of 1861 to 1865. This is the first time in the history of the Southern camps that this honor has been accorded a Negro. And the fact that there are 100 or so white men who had to endorse his application is proof sufficient of his worthiness. This gray-haired Negro is Preston Roberts of Collierville, Tennessee, sometimes camp servant and cook in the command of the Confederate cavalry leader, General Nathan Bedford Forrest, and at present, when on military duty, regiment servant for the 1st Tennessee Regiment Confederate Veterans. When the crosses of honor were first bestowed on the veterans of Memphis, Uncle Press felt somewhat slighted and forlorn, for he served through 4 years, going out with his young master when the first call of soldiers to defend the South was made. He pondered the matter over, and when 18 additional crosses were awarded by the Daughters of the Confederacy the night of Lee's birthday anniversary on January 19th, he asked permission to apply for one of them. Permission was not only readily given by the women, but the men present who knew Uncle Press, and there were few who did not know him, immediately volunteered to furnish the endorsement which is necessary before any veteran is qualified to receive one. The application has been forwarded, and when the next presentation of crosses is made, the rebel Negro will stand in line with the men by whose side he served and receive his bronze medal. Uncle Press is a typical antebellum darky. He was born 60-odd years ago near Collierville, about 20 miles from Memphis, and was body servant to his master, S.H. Roberts. When the call for soldiers came in 1861, Uncle Press enlisted with his young master, F.T. Scott, in Capt. Ed Porter's company, which was raised in Somerville and which was part of General Van Dorn's command. He followed this fortune of this command until the gallant Van Dorn was killed at the Battle of Spring Hill about 2 years later. Then he followed his master, General Forrest's command. Here he was not a regularly enlisted soldier, but, to use his own expression, was one of the most important men in the Army, having under his control 75 Negro cooks with money and authority to buy whatever was needed for his men, and also authority to raise the rations anyway, whether they could be bought or not. This is my great-great-grandfather, and he is also the son of his master, S.H. Roberts, who is Schuyler Roberts, one of 2 of the largest slave owners in the state of Tennessee, I've been told. So last year, a relative of mine, a cousin of mine, reached out. She was very excited because the Daughters of the Confederacy wanted to place a marker on our ancestors' grave. A backstory is that since I was about somewhere between 12, 13, every Sunday at my grandparents' dinner table, my uncle Kenneth would tell the family story. Somewhere around the same time that the movie Roots came out, my uncle would sit and he'd start telling the story so much until the children, we would start humming the theme to Roots. And so my family tree was not new to me. We knew that we could trace our family through Schuyler Roberts all the way actually back to Germany. We knew that my grandfather, Preston Roberts's, one of his sons, John Roberts, had left Germantown and moved to Memphis because he didn't want to be in the country. But that we had family and roots and people had property out in that area. What we kind of knew was that Germantown, where my grandmother said she came from, was established by German immigrants for the purpose of freeing slaves. Now, whether or not that's true or not, that's kind of what we were sort of told. And there was some strength to it in that all of my grandmother's uncles and relatives had land out there. When my cousin called me, and she doesn't live in the city, when she called, I wasn't really surprised by the idea of looking at family history, but I was surprised. I did not know this part of our family story. I had no idea that my great-great-grandfather had been a part of the Confederacy, and certainly did not know that he had worked under Nathan Bedford Forrest. And so when they were asking to put a marker on his grave, I had great reservations and expressed those reservations to my cousin. And we kind of, it's polite to say we did not agree on whether or not we should do that. She's not from this part of the world, and so I tried to explain to her who Nathan Bedford Forrest had been for my family or for the knowledge of my community. When my mother moved to Nashville, right outside of Nashville in 1982, some of the last things my grandfather said to her was, "Be careful, you're headed into Nathan Bedford Forrest territory," which was, very clear. You're headed to Klanville. And so that's what I knew about Nathan Bedford Forrest. And the idea that the Daughters of the Confederacy would want to put a marker just was unsettling to me. I did not really understand why. And in the polite but nonetheless strained exchange between and the young woman who was wanting to do it, and she was very polite and I think well-intended. But one of the things that stood out for me was she said, "Well, we don't want him to be forgotten." Well, my response was, one, he's not forgotten. We know exactly who he is. He's our family member. And the second was that he had already gotten this award, right? Because there was an article. The only reason she knew was because in 1904, they made a point of awarding him, and he is known as the first. But what was more troubling to me personally was trying to reconcile my family's fight for equality and what I grew up knowing about the struggle and race relations, to reconcile that with a great-great-grandfather who was decorated in the Confederacy was disconcerting, to say the least. The first time I began to think it through was as I stood at the vigil that we had downtown. It was that last fall, I think, last December, related to the lynching and calling the names of those who had been lynched, and standing near where Nathan Bedford Forrest's enterprise, alleged enterprise, and the discussion of changing that marker to more realistically reflect what his business enterprise was. So I stood there, offering a song and listening to those names, and I just kept gnawing on or working with who was my great-great-grandfather in this. And Pan Awesome said to me, "Roz," because it was very heavy on me. She says, "Roz, people, life is not simple. People make very difficult choices, or they make hard choices." And so that's kind of where I am today. Is I my belief that the Daughters of the Confederacy did not need to place a marker, I still believe that. I hold it very close. My cousin and I were on opposite sides of it, but we started the conversation before Charleston, right? Literally, we started the conversation before Charleston. And so while we didn't agree, to me, everything in the universe was saying, this is not over. We're not post-racial. We're not these symbols and these images, and for better or for worse, whoever Nathan Bedford Forrest was, the War of the States, regardless of how we write it, for me and my understanding, it was over an economy built off of enslaved people. And that is untenable. I can't make that okay. So when I think of my great-great-grandfather, I give permission for the fact that clearly he was a man of his time. And that I take, I say that I would not have agreed with him then, and I don't agree with him now, but I'm very grateful for obviously what he did, because I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be here. The place where my great-great-grandfather is buried, I have visited. I grew up knowing that the family would go out there. My grandmother and even my mother and her siblings would go out to the church and clean the graves. And early in ministry, I have preached at that church, and ironically, I preached there as a part of the Good Friday Holy Week this past year. So, and walked back around those graves and stood and talked to my ancestors. I don't really know who my great-great-grandfather was. He was born a slave. Even if I make Schuyler Roberts out to be a benevolent slave owner, he was still a slave owner. And what I think I decided when I would come here today, that what I would, if the Daughters of the Confederacy were to ask me again today, what I would want them to do for me is help me find his mother. Because on his death certificate, he was born in 1838, 100 years before my mother was born. 100 years before his son, John Roberts, would die, 2 months after my mother was born, right? He was 23 years old when he went with his master into the Army, into the Confederacy. He was 66 years old when he took it upon himself to say, I deserve some recognition. I can't take that away from him. I think that fight is still in the family, right? I think that part makes me proud, that he is, that was his life, and he had lived that life, and he had lived it to the best of his ability, had given his best. I would like to think that he was a spy, but evidence doesn't say that. But the fact that he knew how to stand up at age 66, how long had he lived without that? You know, the fact that the article talks about he felt slighted and forlorn means that he knew that he had been overlooked. The fact that they gave him the recognition was the least that they could do. And he died 6 years later in 1910. My grandmother was born in 1909. She did not get to really know this man. And my great-grandfather, who left that area and came this way, maybe, I don't know, maybe part of his leaving was to leave all of that behind, right? To let go of all of that. But what I would like for somebody to help me know is when my great-great-grandfather died, on Ancestry.com, when you pull up his death certificate, Schuyler Roberts, the master, his father, is named on his death certificate. His mother is not named on that death certificate. We think her name is Mahala, but finding her has been a challenge. I can trace Schuyler Roberts all the way back, and all of his little branches, and folks who would like to know who my family is, and folks who don't want to be related to me at all. I can follow them. But I grew up knowing that there was a slave girl, and we thought her name was Mahala. But I don't have any record of Mahala. So if the Daughters of the Confederacy really want to do an honorable thing for me, they would help me find that woman and help me honor her life and her story. And so I think my takeaway right now is that there's still names that are not recognized. And if we really want to do some reconciliation, then it's not about putting medals on folks at this point. It's about calling names and reconciling that part of the story.